This talk is entitled "The Ruin is Ruined, the History of Jerusalem's Old City Synagogues." Okay, so how old is a synagogue? Excuse me just one second. How old are synagogues? Well, the answer is perhaps not as old as you might think. So the oldest synagogues that we have in Israel date back to the end of the period of the Second Temple. So if the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE, so before the end there were already synagogues. And where are these synagogues? Well, we know of synagogues in Gamla, Masada, there's a couple around Modi'in, and there's a few others as well. But in Jerusalem, the only evidence of a synagogue has been found in the city of David, and this is the Theodotos Inscription, which was written in Greek and was found in the turn of the century, I think in turn of the 20th century. So I think in 1903 it was found in the city of David. And on this description is a description of what you do in the synagogue. And it doesn't say that you argue, you disagree all the time with the rabbi. It doesn't say that you have a kiddush or anything like that. It says that the synagogue is a place where people used to gather to hear the reading of the law and also to discuss, the reading of the Torah, and also to discuss the laws, the halachot. That's what a synagogue was for. Skipping on in time, so if we go past the destruction of the temple, so we know the famous story that Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva, they were ascending to Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple, and when they arrived at Mount Scopus, they saw the temple, and all the rabbis, they rented their clothes and they went into mourning, apart from Rabbi Akiva, who laughed. So I won't go through the whole story, it's a very famous story. But the point is that they arrived at Mount Scopus, Har Tzufim. Why were they there? Because apparently they were not allowed, Jews were not allowed into Jerusalem. And Jews weren't allowed into Jerusalem, either from the destruction or from the time of the Bar Kokhba revolution, which happened about 60 years after the destruction of the temple. And that was the time that Rabbi Akiva lived. So Jews were not allowed into Jerusalem. And seemingly throughout the time of the Romans and into the Christian period, the Byzantine period, this prohibition on Jews going into Jerusalem remained. Jews could not live in Jerusalem. And there's very good evidence of this, because if you look in lots of places in the Galil, in the Golan, even in the hills south of Hebron, we find all over the place, we find synagogues from the Byzantine period, and the famous synagogue at Bet Alpha is another one that with its famous mosaic floor. They're all over the place. But we don't find any synagogues in Jerusalem from that period. So seemingly, when Jerusalem was Christian, Jews were not allowed to live in Jerusalem. But in 1638, Jerusalem stopped being predominantly Christian. It was conquered by the Muslims, by the Caliph Umar, who was the caliph that took over after the death of Muhammad. And here you see Umar on his camel, and lots of slain people around him. But he signed a treaty with the Christians, whereby he said, okay, Christians, you can go on worshipping in Jerusalem, but you have to know that you're going to be second-class citizens and you're going to have to pay taxes to the Arab rulers. And seemingly, there was some kind of similar arrangement made with the Jews. Were there Jews living in Jerusalem in the 7th, 8th century? In truth, we really don't know, because the first evidence of Jews living in Jerusalem came, so the Crusaders came and they slaughtered Christians, maybe they slaughtered Jews as well. There may have been a few Jews living in Jerusalem under the Crusaders, but the first evidence that we have of Jews properly living in worshipping in Jerusalem was in 1267. And we have that because it's not because there's anything left of a synagogue, but because it was written down by Nachmanides, the Ramban, who wrote, "Great is the neglect and the vast is the destruction. The entire temple is utterly ruined. Jerusalem is thoroughly destroyed, and we found a house in the ruins built with marble columns and a beautiful dome. We took it to the synagogue because the city is abandoned, and anyone who wishes to take from the ruins can help himself. And this he wrote in a letter to his son. And about 150 years later, Rav Avadja of Bar Tanura, he wrote that during his visit to Jerusalem in the 15th century, he found a synagogue in Jerusalem, which is built upon columns. It's long and narrow and dark and has no light except from a single opening. And this seemingly what he found was the first synagogue, which was the synagogue that was built by the Ramban. And you can visit that synagogue today. Not the original synagogue. We'll talk about that in a moment. But you can visit the rebuilt synagogue of the Ramban, which is underneath the Hurva Synagogue. And actually, the synagogue, which you see in the picture here, is built by and large. It's built underground, perhaps reflecting the fact that at the time of the Ramban, Jews could be in Jerusalem. They could worship, but it had to be underground. Okay, not to offend the Arabs. Moving on a little bit in time, so the 4 Sephardic synagogues, which can be visited again today, and this is, again, they've been reconstructed. When were they built? Seemingly they were built in the 16th century. So Jews were expelled from Spain and Portugal at the end of the 15th century in 1495, if I'm not mistaken. And Jews migrated to all the corners of the Ottoman Empire, including Jerusalem. And included just a small story about one of the 4 Sephardic synagogues, which is the Eliyahu Hanavi synagogue. So I remember when I was a young lad growing up in London, and we didn't, in the synagogue where I davened, we didn't always have a minyan, particularly, we had a minyan on Shabbat, but we didn't always have a minyan during the week. So there was a minyan duty where you got called up, you got picked up, and you got brought to shul, hopefully to make up the 10 men of the minyan. And often it didn't quite work out, so there were 9 men, and the gabba used to go out onto Ballard's Lane, and there used to be, like, you know, these old tramps that used to walk by, and somehow the gabba knew which of these old tramps was Jewish. And a similar thing happened with the 4 Sephardic synagogues. They were actually on Yom Kippur. They had 9 people, and they didn't know what to do, but suddenly this old man came along, and he joined them, and he spent the day with them in prayer and fasting. And at the end of Yom Kippur, I don't know what Sephardim eat at the end of Yom Kippur, but they wanted to invite the old man to break the fast with them, and mysteriously he vanished, which of course proved that this old man was none other than Eliyahu Hanavi, and that gave the name to one of these 4 Sephardic synagogues. But enough about Sephardim, let's talk about Ashkenazim. So we haven't mentioned Ashkenazim, but Ashkenazim were in Palestine. They settled in Sfat in the golden years, in the Middle Ages. But in 1700, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, he came with his disciples from Poland to resettle in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid was, as soon as he arrived, he was ill and he died. But his disciples still tried to build a synagogue for Ashkenazim. And they were very, very poor. They didn't have a lot of money, so they had to borrow money from the Arabs. And 20 years went by. They seemingly didn't succeed to build very much of the synagogue. And by 1720, the Arab creditors got fed up with the whole process and decided to set the synagogue on fire and banish Ashkenazim from Jerusalem. And in the rest of the 18th century, if you wanted to be an Ashkenazi Jew in Jerusalem, you were in danger of your life, and you were much better dressing up as a Sephardi. But in the start of the 19th century, so in 1808, the Perushim, who were disciples of the Vilna Gaon, they moved, some of those also came to live in Palestine. And in 1815, Reb Menachem Mendel of Shklov, I probably didn't pronounce that correctly, he decided that he was going to move to Jerusalem. And there were 50 years that of the early 19th century where the Ashkenazim were trying to build a synagogue for themselves. And they really bashed their heads up against the wall, trying to get permission from the Arabs, who, first of all, were not that pro-building synagogues, certainly not Ashkenazim, and claimed still that they were owed money from 100 years ago from the disciples of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. And really nothing moved. Everything went to, they got permission, didn't get permission, the Arabs attacked them. Until in 1850, we mentioned this before, the Crimea War kind of changed things. And the Western powers started to gain more influence with the Ottomans. And the guy that really changed it was the gentleman that you see on the right, whose name is James Finn. He was the British consul in Jerusalem. He was a devout Christian, and he became very committed to supporting the Ashkenazic Jews and allowing them to build a synagogue. And in 1855, Moses Montefiore finally received in Constantinople, he received a firman from the Ottoman rulers, which allowed the Ashkenazim to build their long requested synagogue. The cornerstone was laid in 1856, and so the whole process, again, the building process was extremely slow. You can see it took 10 years to build the synagogue, but finally in 1864, the synagogue was dedicated in the name of Bet Yaakov. Yaakov was in memory of James Mayer de Rothschild, who was the father of Baron Alphonse Rothschild, if I'm not mistaken, who actually came to the dedication ceremony. As so often happens, the name Beis Yaakov didn't stick, and the synagogue became known as the Hurva, or the ruined synagogue, after the ruins which stood there for more than 100 years from the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. And the synagogue very rapidly became a major focus point of Ashkenazic religious life in Jerusalem. So many ceremonies were held there. In 1901, even a memorial service was held after the death of Queen Victoria. 1921, Rav Kook was appointed chief rabbi in the Hurva Synagogue. You see here a picture of the original bima, and at the top, this is even in the Second World War. So at the top, you see a whole load of soldiers. These are soldiers of the free Poles who were in Palestine in the 1940s. And another picture from 1940. This is 1942, and you actually see this is the Gera Rebbe, also in the Hurva Synagogue. In 1948, the War of Independence started on the 14th of May. The Old City got taken over by the Jordanian Arab Legion. And on the 25th of May, the commander of the Arab Legion forces, Abdullah El-Tal, he wrote to the Red Cross and he told them that unless the Haganah abandoned its positions in the synagogue, he would be forced to attack it. On May the 27th, El-Tel received no answer to his proposition. He told his men, get the Hurva synagogue by noon. And Fawzi El-Katoub executed the mission by placing a 200-liter barrel filled with explosives against the synagogue wall. The explosion resulted in a gaping hole, and the Haganah fighters spent 45 minutes fighting in vain to prevent the legionnaires from entering. When they finally burst through, they tried to reach the top of its dome, to plant an Arab flag. 3 of the Arab legionnaires were shot by snipers, but a 4th succeeded. And the Arab flag flying over the old city skyline basically represented the end of the struggle for the old city and the takeover of the old city by the Jordanians. The legionnaires, not content with that, they blew up the Hurva synagogue, reducing the 84-year-old synagogue to rubble. And that was a pattern that was reflected across the old city as another 57 Jewish sanctuaries were purposely and systematically destroyed by the Jordanians after their capture of the old city in 1948. Here you see a picture, a rather grainy one, of a Jordanian Arab legionnaire in front of the Hurva synagogue. Okay, so 1967, we know the Israelis succeeded to recapture the old city. And that was the beginning of a debate, what to do with all the buildings that the Jordanians had destroyed. And Teddy Kollek said, should we in the Jewish quarter have, Teddy Kollek, by the way, if you didn't know, was the former mayor, when in 1967 he was the mayor of Jerusalem. And he said, should we in the Jewish quarter have a building of major importance, which competes with the mosque and the Holy Sepulchre? And should we in general have any building which would compete in importance with the Western Wall of the Temple? So he was against rebuilding the Hurva Synagogue. In 1977, a kind of, not a compromise, but a memorial to the Hurva Synagogue was built. You see it on the right-hand side. So a dome which was about half as high as the original roof of the synagogue was erected to remind people that this is where the Hurva Synagogue stood. I remember when I first came to Israel in 1981, I was here for Tisha B'Av, and we actually spent the evening underneath this arch. Debates went on in the 1980s whether to rebuild the synagogue. This is a stamp from 1993, 45 years after independence. It shows a picture of the old Hurva Synagogue, which in 1993, nothing had been agreed on whether to rebuild, whether to not rebuild. But finally, in the year 2000, the Likud government was elected. And I think that's 2000, Barak resigned, and he was replaced, I think, by Arik Sharon, if I'm not mistaken. And a plan was finally approved by the Knesset to rebuild the Hurva Synagogue. And Natan Meltzer, who was a Jerusalem architect, he was the architect, and his plan was approved, and it was decided to rebuild the Hurva Synagogue not exactly, but more or less in the style that was destroyed by the Jordanians in 1948. So in 2005, reconstruction began, and on March the 15th, 2010, an official opening ceremony was held, attended by politicians, the chief rabbis, to celebrate the reopening of the Hurva Synagogue, which you see on the right-hand side, and if you visit Jerusalem's Old City, you can see it in the flesh. Okay, how did the Arabs react to that? Well, perhaps not surprisingly, Khalid Mashal, who was a spokesman for Hamas, I think he still is, if I'm not mistaken, he declared the opening of the Hurva as a declaration of war and a falsification of history. The organization of the Islamic Conference said reopening of the Hurva risks dragging the region into a religious war. The best one, the one that I like best, was from the Jordanian government, who, of course, had spent their time in illegal occupation of East Jerusalem, of course, and they'd spent their time smashing up every single holy Jewish site, and they called on world parties to counter the international legitimacy of what Israel had done in rebuilding the Hurva Synagogue. Iran urged the international community to respond. The Palestinians called for a day of rage, and there was a day of rage. There were riots and clashes with the Israeli police. And in September, Hamas uploaded a video which showed the Hurva Synagogue under missile attack. Not a genuine video, I hasten to add. But I didn't want to end with a list of Hamas and Iran attacking the opening of the synagogue. So just end with a small video.
תעלה בקשר מול המפקדה, שתגידו להם שאנחנו צריכים תגבורת כמה שיותר מהר.
מפקד, כאן ככה רובע. הליגיון הירדני פרץ פנימה. אנחנו חייבים תגבורת עכשיו. יש לנו פצועים והרוגים. קיבלתי, עבור. קיבלתי. מפקד, כוחותינו נסוגים. הם לא יכולים לעזור לנו. אנחנו כאן לבד עבור.
חיילים, נילחם עד הכדור האחרון.
course, that was acted out. But as the Hurva Synagogue fell, it was heard over the radio the words Hahurva Hurva, meaning that the ruin is ruined, or the Hurva Synagogue is destroyed. And that is the end of tonight's talk.